Hi, fourth grade. Miss Ringsred here with my first video of Number the Stars. So, if you want to cozy in, find a good spot to relax and listen, I've got my blankie and my sloth bookmark. I'm ready to go. While I'm reading, I'm going to ask you some questions that I want you to think through while I'm reading. Remember, we left off in the book where Anne Marie is running through the woods. She has a basket with her. If you remember what's in that basket, she's got things like cheese and bread and apples, all stuff that was rationed. And underneath all that stuff, remember that there is a packet. And we don't know what's inside the packet, but that it's important and that Uncle Henrik needs it. If you remember, she's running through the dark woods. It's really early in the morning, and I bet it's scary. And she's reciting that story to herself that she tells her sister. And we left off in kind of a spooky part. If you remember, she was coming through the woods and then she heard a noise. This is the last paragraph of the last chapter. Then they were there, in front of her, 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glittering and their lips curled. Chapter 15. My dogs smell meat. Remember, this author titles every chapter for a reason. Anne Marie's mind raced. She remembered what her mother had said. If anyone stops you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a silly little girl. She stared at the soldiers. She remembered how she had stared at others, frightened, and then when they had stopped her on the street. Christy hadn't been frightened. Christy had been, well, nothing more than a silly little girl, angered because the soldiers had touched her hair that afternoon. She had known nothing of danger, and the soldiers had been amused by her. Anne Marie willed herself with all of her being to behave like Christy would. "Good morning," she said carefully to the soldiers. They looked up and down in silence. Both of the dogs were tense and alert. The 2 soldiers who held the leashes wore thick gloves. "What are you doing here?" one of them asked. Anne Marie held out her basket with a thick loaf of bread visible. "My Uncle Henrik forgot his lunch, and I'm taking it to him. He's a fisherman." The soldiers were looking around. Their eyes glanced behind her and scanned the bushes on either side. "Are you alone?" one asked. Anne Marie nodded. "Yes," she said. One of the dogs growled, but she noticed that both dogs were looking at her lunch basket. One soldier stepped forward. The other, and the 2 holding the dogs, remained where they were. "You came out before daybreak just to bring a lunch? Why doesn't your uncle eat fish?" What would Christy reply? Anne Marie tried to giggle the way her sister might. "Uncle Henrik doesn't even like fish," she said, laughing. "He says he sees too much of it and smells too much of it. Anyway, he wouldn't eat it raw." She made a face. "Well, I suppose he would if he were starving, but Uncle Henrik always has bread and cheese for lunch." "Keep chattering," she told herself. "Christy would. A silly little girl. I like fish," she went on. "I like it the way my mother cooks it. Sometimes she rolls it in breadcrumbs and—" One of the soldiers reached forward and grabbed the crisp loaf of bread from the basket. He examined it carefully and then broke it in half, pulling the 2 halves apart with his fists. That that would have enraged Christy. She knew it. "Don't!" Anne Marie said angrily. That's Uncle Henrik's bread. My mother baked it. The soldier ignored her. He tossed the two halves of the loaf on the ground, one in front of each dog. They consumed it, each snapping at the bread and gulping it so that it was gone in an instant. Have you seen anyone in the woods? The soldier barked the question at her. No, only you. Anne Marie stared at him. What are you doing in the woods anyway? You're making me late. Uncle Henrik's boat will leave before I get there with his lunch, or what's left of his lunch. The soldier picked up the wedge of cheese. He turned it over in his hand. He turned to the three behind him and asked them something in his own language. One of them answered, "Nine," in a bored tone. Anne Marie recognized the word. The man had replied, "No." He had probably asked, Anne Marie thought, "Do you want this?" Or perhaps, "Should I give this to the dogs?" The soldier continued to hold the cheese. He tossed it back and forth between his hands. Anne Marie gave an exasperated sigh. Could I go now, please? She asked impatiently. The soldier reached for the apple. He noted its brown spots and made a face of disgust. Remember, those apples are kind of rotten, right? They were left over. This is like late in the fall. No meat? He asked, glancing at the basket. The napkin that lay in glancing at the basket and the napkin that lay in its bottom. Anne Marie gave him a withering look. You know that we have no meat, she said. Your army eats all of Denmark's meat. Please, please, she implored in her mind, don't lift that napkin. The soldier laughed. He dropped the bruised apple on the ground, and one of the dogs leaned forward, pulling at its leash, sniffed the apple, and stepped back. But both dogs still looked intently at the basket, their ears alert, their mouths open, saliva glistening on their smooth pink gums. My dog smells meat, the soldier said. They smell squirrels in the woods, Anne Marie responded. You should take them hunting? The soldier reached forward with the cheese in one hand as if he was going to return it into the basket, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the flowered cotton napkin. Anne Marie froze. Your uncle has a pretty little lunch, the soldier said scornfully, crumpling the napkin around the cheese in his hand. Like a woman, he added with contempt. Then his eyes locked on the basket. He handed the cheese and the napkin to the soldier beside him. What's that there in the bottom? He asked in a different, tenser tone. What would Christy do? Anne Marie stomped her foot suddenly. To her own surprise, she began to cry. I don't know, she said, her voice choking. My mother's going to be angry that you stopped me and made me late, and you've completely ruined Uncle Henrik's lunch. So now he'll be mad at me, too. The dogs whined and struggled against the leashes, nosing forward to the basket. One of the soldiers muttered something in German. The soldier took out the packet. Why was this so carefully hidden? He snapped. Anne Marie wiped her eyes on her sleeve of her sweater. It wasn't hidden any more than the napkin was. I don't know what it is. And that, she realized, was true. She had no idea what was in the packet. The soldier tore the packet open, and while below him, the soldier tore the paper open. While below him on the ground, the dogs strained and snarled, pulling against their leashes. Their muscles were visible beneath their sleek, short-haired flesh. He looked inside and then glanced at Anne Marie. Stop crying, you idiot girl, he said harshly. Your stupid mother has sent your uncle a handkerchief. In Germany, the women have better things to do. They don't stay home hemming handkerchiefs for the men." He gestured with the folded white cloth and gave a short laugh. At least she didn't stitch flowers on it. He flung it to the ground, still half wrapped in paper, beside the apple, and the dogs lunged, sniffing it eagerly, and then subsided, disappointed again. "Go on," the soldier said. He dropped the cheese and the napkin back into her basket. Go on to your uncle and tell him the German dogs enjoyed his bread." All of the soldiers pushed past her. One of them laughed, and they spoke to each other in their own language. And in a moment, they had disappeared down the path in the direction from which Anne Marie had just come. Quickly, she picked up the apple and opened the packet with the white handkerchief inside. She put them in the basket and ran around the bend toward the harbor, where the morning sky was now bright with early sun, and some of the boat engines were starting. The Ingenborg was still there by the dock, and Uncle Henrik was there, with his light hair windblown and bright as he knelt by the nets. Anne Marie called to him, and he came to the side, his face worried when he recognized her on the dock. She handed him the basket. "Mama sent your lunch," she said, her voice quivering. But the soldiers stopped me, and they took your bread." She didn't dare to tell him more. Henrik glanced quickly in the basket. She could see the look of relief on his face and knew that it was because he saw the packet was there, even though it was torn open. "Thank you," he said, and the relief in his voice was evident. Anne Marie looked quickly around the familiar small boat. She could see down the passageway into the empty cabin. There was no sign of the Rosens or the others. Uncle Henrik followed her eyes and her puzzled look. "All is well," he said swiftly. "Don't worry. Everything is all right." "I wasn't sure," he said. "But now," he eyed the basket, "because of you, Anne Marie, everything is all right. You run home now and tell your mamma not to worry. I will see you this evening." He grinned at her suddenly. "They took my bread, eh?" he said. "I hope that they choke on it." And that is the end of chapter 15. Thanks for listening.